Okay, so this is Lisa Nakamura's entry on media for the keywords for American cultural studies, right? This is just a nice kind of, I think this week, if it's not clear, especially with the added sort of mini lecture with the slides that I'll talk about separately on Moodle, that this is a good week of kind of like a sort of a reassessment point or sort of like a pause so we can kind of regroup. And this reading is very similar to the Douglas Kellner reading, where it's like it's more kind of like about the discipline, or sort of gives an overarching argument as opposed to kind of like a summary and kind of overview. It's a primer rather than like kind of a study in and of itself. So it's like read it for your own review. But there's only a few points. There are only 2 points that I want to specifically talk about, and it's on 167, and it's specifically it's about halfway through that left column, but it's particularly in terms of media and politics, right? And what sort of analysis we're doing, what kind of critique are we doing? And so we in the class so far, we haven't really talked terribly much about let's say kind of these questions of disenfranchisement, inequality, coercion. Although we have, it just might not seem that explicit. Specifically, like to be kind of more sort of explicit, like we haven't really dealt with identity politics head on. We haven't really talked about sexism, racism, homophobia, transphobia, and other sort of issues of marginalization. But what I want to point out is that we have, and it's always been kind of in the background, and that's precisely why we talk about things like one of the reasons that we're constantly talking about, and that's what the other mini lecture is really about, that we're talking about industry, and we're doing so much industry study, is that those kind of large sort of overarching sort of movements that we don't necessarily see are precisely kind of that which enables and allows for other kind of more granular and specific iterations of whether of marginalization and discrimination. Or to give you like a just kind of more concrete example, we might not be talking about the representation of people of color as much in an actual TV show, right? So like to kind of carry off or to kind of bring back the example earlier from last week, we're not talking about the representation of women in Jessica Jones or black people in Luke Cage, right? What we are talking about, however, is that those people that might be targeted by those shows, in the sense that the audiences, the demographics that those shows were made for, might not actually have access to those shows, right? We only see, for those, but most of us do, although I know for a fact that a lot of you don't have access to high-speed internet right now, and it's becoming incredibly difficult. It's something that we enjoyed on campus. That's a similar kind of, we're talking more about that, right? On a broad level, how are people being excluded? Not the way that they're being included when we can see it. And another kind of comparable example that I give you that's one of my favorite examples is that, I talk about this, some of you are familiar with this, in the video game Overwatch. It's one of the rare games where there is representation of Africa, like actual continental Africa. There are I want to say at least 4 characters that are come from continental Africa, from African countries. There are 5 or so maps that are placed in Africa. So Overwatch is a game that gets lauded for its representation of Africa, right? But on the other hand, there was an article a few years ago that there's all this representation, but you know what they don't have in Africa? They don't have servers. So African players can't actually play, right? That to me is exactly the sort of thing that we're trying to talk about. Like, what is it that we see? We can see the representation. What is it that we don't see? We don't see the actual inclusion, right? Because that's happening on an economic level, and a technological level, and an infrastructural level, right? What would it take for Blizzard to actually put servers in Africa? That becomes a much thornier issue, as we've read, right? So it's so much easier to just kind of like, produce models and insert them into the game, right? And to that, Lisa Nakamura is precisely in this passage saying exactly this is why we can't just think about this. We have to think broader, right? We have to do more, right? It's like, we can't ever think like, oh, but I've already done this much. It's like, we should always be thinking, no, there's so much more that needs to be done, right? So, in that passage, she notes, to address this type of history, media criticism and analysis will have to turn away from the narrow focus on representations of stereotypes as the most central form of media influence. So, stereotypes, according to Nakamura, who herself is a woman of color, right, are not the primary, or it's not the central form of media influence. Meaning negative images, or even positive, because like stereotypes can be positive too. The images of minorities or disenfranchised or at-risk people is not the primary way that media affects these things. It's not the images that's the problem. Instead, we have to turn our attention to the intersections of the design, implementation, and production of media technologies themselves. We have to think broader to the media technologies themselves. We don't want to do this because it's so much easier, to just focus on the content. This materialist or archaeological approach to media, digital or otherwise, urges us to examine not just how media represent or interpolate different cultures, genders, and identities, but also how media devices are produced and marketed. At the end of the entry, Nakamura talks about how social media and new media are not liberatory by default. Like just because we have them doesn't mean that they're going to get us out of things like inequality, right? And in a similar sense, this is why if you look at in the slides, when I talk about and I bring up another reading, like technology itself is not, media is not neutral, technology is not neutral. It's not just an issue of the content, but we have to look at the actual technology itself to see, how it, because the thing is at the end of the day, people made these things, people with foibles. Why do we think that, it's as if some sort of neutral, transcendental third party made the iPad, and that there isn't some sort of there aren't, kind of unsavory elements baked into this thing itself, right? Okay, so let us move on.